welcome everyone. I'm stepping in for Jo today because she's got a sore throat and is not feeling at her best. So apologies if I'm just looking like I'm a bit disorganized. I am, but very keen to support this seminar series. So thanks, Jo, for making the show go on. I want everyone to note that the first half of this seminar is going to be recorded today. So let Jo know if that's going to be an issue. And for those online, feel free to turn off your camera if you prefer as well. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. I want to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today, and to the traditional custodians of the lands from which our online attendees may be joining if you're not on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. The sovereignty of this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Our first speaker today is PhD candidate Terri Warner. Terri has over a decade experience working as a lived experience advocate, an educator and researcher, mostly in the area of mental health. Her lifelong experiences of disability, mental distress and mental health, and social care service use inform her work. Terri's master's thesis articulated a critical analysis of mental health and disability policy in Australia, from a deinstitutionalisation to the introduction of the NDIS. She's presently undertaking her PhD and is an NDIS participant in the primary psychosocial disability group. Welcome, Terri.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm sure by now you've all had a chance to read my fabulous wall of words here. And if you're looking at that and thinking, look, I don't know what any of those things mean separately, let alone how they might relate to each other. Let me assure you that I've spent considerably more than the 2 years I've been a PhD candidate trying to make sense of these things and to get to a point where the title of my own presentation makes sense to me. And I have just committed to explaining all of this in 20 minutes, so go me. No pressure. So what I'm going to try and do here, if the thing will actually progress, is talk a little bit about what a psychosocial disability is and who has one, and why that's still a question, why it matters who has one and what it means. And also, I will then move on to talk about epistemological pluralism and why it's actually useful when we're doing this kind of work. I'll talk a bit about the research I've been doing and some of my findings, and then try and bring it all together so you have a sense of what the point of any of this was in the first place. So to kick off, we actually didn't use the term psychosocial disability widely in Australia before the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's still not well understood or consistently defined globally, and who has one depends very much on the purpose for which it's been defined. Now, in the NDIS context, it is a policy category, and there are a couple of things worth noting about policy categories. First one being that some of them are about eligibility criteria, and this is certainly the case for psychosocial disability under the NDIS. But often these eligibility criteria actually define categories of person rather than categories of thing. And that means that these categories can have broad effects outside of the policies that they're created for. In particular, they can influence how we think about ourselves and other people, and they can set entire groups against each other. Now, in the NDIS context, what we are talking about is this less than 2% at the top of the donut. So back in 2011, the Productivity Commission agreed that some people with a mental health diagnosis would be eligible for the NDIS. And that's that little wedge there, that less than 2% of all of the people in the country who have a mental health diagnosis. By the NDIS definition, everyone with a psychosocial disability is in this donut, but not everyone in the donut has a psychosocial disability. The definitions outside of the NDIS will tend to disagree with this one way or the other. So either by saying you don't have to have a mental health diagnosis in order to have a psychosocial disability, or by saying that potentially everyone with a mental health diagnosis has a psychosocial disability. So there's disagreement there already. If you look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, for them, a psychosocial disability includes mental health diagnoses, but isn't limited to it. So according to the ABS, you don't have to be in the donut to have a psychosocial disability. Outside of the ABS and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, there are actually very few uses of the term psychosocial disability in Australian policy documents, in legislation, or in guidelines. The Disability Discrimination Act does consider the types of disorders we would consider to be mental health diagnoses as disabilities, but they don't name a particular term for that group. What they actually say is that a disorder, illness, or disease that affects a person's thought processes, perception of reality, emotions, or judgment, or that results in disturbed behavior is a disability, according to discrimination legislation. But again, no actual term for this group. If you are wondering if any of our fabulous international classification systems like the ICD-10, ICD-11, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the International Classification of Function, if any of those classification systems define psychosocial disability, the short answer is no, they do not. It's not a thing. If you then look at the international literature, and this is just based on a PubMed search for psychosocial disability or psychosocial disabilities, what you get is roughly 360 papers over 50 years. And yes, a lot of these associate psychosocial disability with mental health diagnoses, particularly schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, anxiety disorders, and alcohol-related disorders. But what you're seeing on the screen here is a list of the other health conditions that clinical researchers have considered to result in psychosocial disability. Well, I think my favorite one on this list is low literacy, which takes the notion of psychosocial disability entirely out of the medical realm. Now, I'm going to give the final word on what a psychosocial disability is to the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. Now, they were involved in drafting the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and everyone in the World Network consider themselves to be a person with a psychosocial disability. And they seem to have a pretty clear idea of what it means to them. But because that term psychosocial disability isn't understood globally, they actually agreed to use mental impairment within the text of the CRPD. And for them, people with mental impairment said, if we take those two terms to be interchangeable, persons with psychosocial disability include all of these people within these groups. So what this actually does is it constructs psychosocial disability in these personal and political domains, moving it again outside of what's medical and what's policy. And this way of understanding psychosocial disability is really grounded in the social model of disability. So at this point, we have a category, not a great deal of agreement about who's in it. So there are a lot of ways that this could play out for the people who find themselves in this category. And a lot of that turns on how it's defined and by whom. Yes, the definition has significant policy consequences, but I'm especially interested in why this category matters for the people who might be in it. So if you look at it as recognition that mental health conditions belong in a disability category, there is a lot of potential for that category because it gives people a new way of understanding and explaining their experiences that isn't grounded in the idea of a psychiatric illness. Also, disability identity is seen as a really positive and constructive thing for people to develop. You can also find, people can also find that they have expanded eligibility for supports, and that if they can say they have a disability, those support needs might actually be taken more seriously at the individual level than if they are talking about mental health needs. One of the great things about being grounded in the social model is that that says your impairments only exist in the absence of a suitable environment, and given the correct environment, a person is no longer disabled. And from that, in a mental health context, we get the idea that recovery is actually a community responsibility, and that accessible environments can and should be created to meet people's mental health needs. And also, it does raise questions, really important questions about what actually is a disability, what actually is a mental illness, and who decides, and unsettling these definitions that we already consider to be settled is a really important and useful thing to be doing. However, if we look at it as a very narrow eligibility category, we have some potential negative consequences, that being that developing a mental illness identity is not so positive or constructive, and that all of those positive effects that you see, that you get from identifying as a person with psychosocial disability, can be undermined very easily by experts who disagree that that's what you have, or that you qualify to be in that group. That can have broad-ranging consequences for an individual person, like things like access restrictions in other areas. So being eligible in this narrow group might rule you out of eligibility in other areas. And being in this very narrow group also creates this problem where your support options are limited. And there is actually an ongoing battle over whether the NDIS should fund physical therapies for psychosocial disability. And also paradoxically, whether the NDIS should fund psychological therapies for psychosocial disability. So it's all quite an important battleground that is really having an impact on people's lives. And some of the unfortunate unintended consequences of the social model of disability, when you have these narrow categories, are that depending on who's in and who's out, you can actually widen gaps and entrench equality, because you're saying that there is a group of people who are too much, not enough, or the wrong kind of distressed, ill, or disabled to access support. And another broad unintended consequence of the social model is the fact that meeting one group's access needs might actually create access barriers for another group. So you're always having this problem of rights infringing on rights. And then when you start questioning what we consider to be established terms with meanings that we know, you might not like where that takes everyone. It may not turn out so well in your favor. Now, if none of that is compelling, it matters because there are consequences for how people see themselves that can in turn positively or negatively affect their outcomes and their prognosis. So psychological theories of identity tell us that if you form a disability identity, what that means is you're seeing yourself as a member of a diverse and marginalized group within society, and that is really positive and helpful. If you form a mental illness identity, that means you're internalizing the negative attributes of a diagnosis, like seeing it as intractable. And again, not very positive, not very helpful. And one of the very early concerns with the NDIS was what would happen if people started seeing themselves as having a permanent psychosocial disability. How would that then impact their hope for recovery? So if a psychosocial disability is the functional impacts of a mental health diagnosis, what happens then if they form a psychosocial disability identity? And what is the impact of then having one imposed by something as big and impactful as the NDIS? The answer is we don't know, because no one's actually looked at it from the perspective of identity and group membership before. But we don't just form identities around group membership. Now, Manuel Castells, who's a Spanish sociologist, he talks about how power relationships shape identity. So you can ask whether psychosocial disability is a disability identity or a mental illness identity, and then ask what that means for the person. But you can also ask whether it operates as a legitimizing or a resistance identity, and what that then means in terms of the emancipating potential of the label. So where are we at this point with respect to psychosocial disability? Still not clear on what it is, who does or doesn't have one, or what it means, but hopefully with a bit of a sense that it matters what it means and who decides. So moving on now to my favorite thing to talk about, which is epistemological pluralism. And when I say epistemological pluralism, I am drawing on the work of Paul Feyerabend and his anarchistic theory of knowledge. Now, Feyerabend was a philosopher of science, originally a physicist. He was quite controversial, and it's fair to say that the scientific community didn't entirely embrace his ideas. They were particularly upset that he said the only universal methodological rule that can be derived from an analysis of the history of science is that anything goes. Scientists don't like it when you say that kind of thing, it turns out. So for Feyerabend, there is no single set of rules that guarantee that research is scientific. Western rationalism is one tradition, and all traditions that give meaning to the lives of those who participate in them should have equal rights and equal access to the centers of power. So for him, He sees that people are being arbitrarily disqualified from the production of knowledge based on how, where, or by whom that knowledge was produced. And he considered science and scientists, that is research and researchers who are embedded in the tradition that dominates research, to be at best complicit and at worst actively participating in this disqualification. Now, because it's a policy category and a subcategory within mental health and a disability category and an identity category, psychosocial disability is really caught up in this battle over knowledge and who should be entitled to produce it. So there is this big question of who ultimately gets to decide what a psychosocial disability is and who has one, and who should be making these decisions. Now, looking at this idea of what is a psychosocial disability, there are already several knowledges on the field. We have a clinical knowledge that might say, look, it's about the functional impacts, and any health condition can result in psychosocial, like impairments of psychosocial function. You have policy knowledge, which might say that person's just not in the donut, sorry. And then you have experiential knowledge, which might say, I don't care what anyone else thinks this means. This is what makes sense of my experiences and the things that have happened to me in the most meaningful way. And the question then becomes, are any of those wrong? Are there any grounds at all for concluding that one of those is more right than the others in all cases? So one of the things I love about epistemological pluralism is how it facilitates this type of transdisciplinarity. So you can actually ask, how many different ways are there of knowing about this? And what does it mean that there are so many of them? What does that mean for this category and who's in it? Now, I'm a lived experience researcher, and one of the things that we get all the time is, well, of course you would foreground lived experience perspectives because, you know, you're one of them. And then you might ask, well, how does that sit with pluralism if you're foregrounding the views and like understandings of a particular group? Especially when we have a lot of tension between particularly clinical and lived experience knowledges. And the answer is that basically what it says on the screen. A feature of the lived experience perspective is embracing diverse and challenging views, even when that diverse and challenging view happens to be, my psychiatrist diagnosed me and put me on medication, and thank you very much, that is perfect. Not everyone with a lived experience has that experience. Not everyone agrees that that is a good or useful way of understanding their experiences, but we still embrace those views. And that means that we're actually looking at a very anti-hierarchical type of pluralism where we're saying all of these exist and they all have equal merit. And ultimately, there's so much context and so much intersectionality when it comes to questions about meaning and identity that you can't help but be pluralistic if you're really trying to make sense of this. So moving on now to some of the things that I've actually done rather than all of these big questions that I still have no answers for. And what I have been looking at, I started with a policy analysis, and look, you can do that entirely on paper. There are reams and reams and reams of policy documents that you can use to inform an analysis. But for me, what's important, like when you're talking about the lived effects of a policy category, the best people to tell you about those things are the people who experience them. So that's the rationale for then adding in interviews and a case study. And I've been getting some fantastic responses from people with all kinds of backgrounds. I'll run you through like a very small section of them. The first one is I've actually talked to a lot of people who are autistic, who have ADHD, about the way that they understand psychosocial disability. And of course, as far as the NDIS is concerned, they're not in that group. But other ways of understanding the group mean that they're firmly in it. And in fact, sometimes autism is used as the sort of model diagnosis for things like impairments of global psychosocial function. Not sure entirely how I feel about that, but it is what it is. And the other thing that's interesting is there are actually a lot of parallels between the neurodiversity movement and the construction of psychosocial disability as a resistance identity, as the World Network has done. The other thing that I've come across is I've had people kind of saying, oh, look, I don't think psoriasis can be a psychosocial disability, but I can see how it might cause one. The problem with this is what they're doing is they're actually basing their reasoning on the assumption that the trajectory towards psychosocial disability is through developing a mental health condition. And I think that has more to do with how entrenched the NDIS definition is than it does with any sort of understanding of the functional impacts of these skin conditions and how they might actually result in problems for people psychosocially. That was a very clumsy way of saying it, I'm sorry. I have come across so much pragmatism. I actually had someone tell me she has a psychosocial disability because she was in one of the Commonwealth programs that was defunded, and the only way she could continue to get support was to transition to the NDIS. So for her, that's what a psychosocial disability is and what it means to have one. I've had people say that if agreeing they have a psychosocial disability is the only way to get support, then they absolutely will agree that they're in that category, even if they don't believe it. And they don't think that proving that they are for a doctor or for the NDIS actually means that they have one, which is fantastically subversive, and I kind of love it. I've also had some people saying they would never access the NDIS because it means they have to have that label attached to them. And that is a deal breaker, even if they need the support. The last theme that I want to highlight here is one that is specifically about language, because people were really divided on this idea of psychosocial disability as a political construct and on who should get to decide who has one. And part of that is to do with how they pull apart the term psychosocial. I did actually have people say they don't like that term, but for wildly different reasons. For some, it was meaningless. For some, it was too medicalized. For some, they were just tired of being categorized as psych anything. So what? What does this mean? Why does it matter? What was the point of me telling you any of this? First of all, I would like to nominate psychosocial disability as an excellent example of why policy categories are not natural ways of grouping people, because it is very unlikely we will ever have a single definition that works in every policy context and that satisfies everyone's understanding of what it actually is and what it means to have one. Also, if I don't get passed on that particular request, it is an excellent example of how policy categories are dividing practices, because this definition is tied to taxpayer funding. So the question of who has a psychosocial disability automatically sets people against each other. And while it's useful to think of identity in terms of group membership, when we're talking about marginalized and oppressed groups, we also need to think about power. And that, I think, is a really important point to be making. And because psychosocial disability is linked exclusively to those mental health diagnoses in the NDIS, this means that if you're in or out of that group, that determines the type of support you can get and the type different people think you should be getting. So this category may have actually created a barrier to inclusion that also makes it harder for people to make meaning out of their experiences. So that's why these meanings really matter. The last point I want to leave you with is this type of research matters. And you might well say she's saying lived experience matters because she's a person with lived experience, and that's very, tautological. What I mean is research that is transdisciplinary, that is pluralistic, that is critical, that is focused on uncovering unexamined assumptions and questioning dominant ways of thinking about and producing knowledge. That is an important type of research. Why? Because research in general, but also specifically in medicine and the side disciplines, has a long history of disqualifying unscientific knowledges and methodologies. And the basis for that is not particularly sound. And also, because even knowing there is no consistent agreed definition, policymakers and stakeholders and individual people within their relationships have been making sweeping statements about the characteristics and needs of people with psychosocial disability, as though they're some sort of homogeneous group that we can make broad decisions about. And a lot of people who are presumed to be in and also presumed to be out of this group have been very badly served as a result. I think I have time for questions, potentially. Any question, many questions? I'm looking over at. I have a question, hooray.
So big. First of all, I'll just grab the microphone. Then everyone can see me.
Hopefully it works.
So first of all, very interesting, very cool. And yes, research is very important. I have two questions. I'm going to ask them both at the same time because I don't forget what they are. The first is, you mentioned, and I'm like very grateful that you did, how it's like a lot of the stuff that comes from like Western science and things like that. So I know that you mentioned definitions related to like the ICD or the DSM. I was just wondering if you have come across definitions that aren't then Western, whether they're from East Asian countries or like Latin America, things like that. And then question two, again, also wondering if you've seen research. I was thinking how, while I understand, I can see how it can play out where people who take a disability identity see like the positive effects of that identity, like the resistance one, versus one with like mental health as their identity more like lower, like positive, like negative impact, just because sometimes for some people historically and culturally, like there's been a negative stigma around mental health. I just think it almost could be also the reverse, especially like, yeah, like I coming from like a psychology background, almost like people, if you take that identity, you'd see the positive, but then if you decide to call yourself and take the label of disability, you'd see negative. So I was wondering if you've seen almost like the research in the opposite direction, and if you have, like why, and if not, taking like my question as a thought example, what would you think?
So question one, there are a lot of user and survivor advocacy groups in West Africa, in South Asia, who have adopted the term psychosocial disability specifically as a resistance identity, because a lot of mental health services in those regions are still causing the kinds of violent and oppressive harms that we like to think we've moved a little bit beyond. And for them, psychosocial disability, because it's grounded in a more social understanding and it doesn't say, I am a defective person who has all of these impairments, that for them is quite emancipatory and liberating. And I love that it's also subverting this idea that's come out of Western psychiatry about what a mental health diagnosis is and what it means to have one. In terms of your second question, there is a lot of context around how a person, like whether a disability identity is positive or negative. And a lot of that is to do with the social context in which the person is operating. So if they have a lot of people around them who still see disability as a personal tragedy and who think about this as, again, defects or impairments in the person, then if they internalize that way of understanding a disability, yeah, absolutely, you can produce a negative disability identity. It's that link to a social movement and that idea that it's a resistance identity and also a project identity, which I don't know if you had a chance to read the definition of that, but when it becomes this project of like, I'm now a strong advocate in a marginalized community, that's when it becomes positive. That's when it becomes constructive, but it can absolutely go either way.
Cool, thank you.
Very quickly.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how policy might be less categorical and more pluralistic. So if we take your model to a policy kind of area, how does that work?
Right. So it is a big question. There's an answer I prepared earlier, because ordinarily, coming from a post-structuralist background, what I like to do is show you the problem and then run in the other direction very fast. But one of the ways that we could actually be more pluralistic in policy is by doing away with these disability categories entirely and looking at, here is a person, they have met the minimum threshold for the NDIS in the sense that they've established they have permanent functional impacts, and a doctor says they have a health condition. And then instead of saying one person, one diagnosis, one category, You say one person NDIS eligible, let's do wraparound supports based on what we know about what they need in their life, which is the original kind of intention of the scheme, at least from the perspective of the disability communities. That was what they were aiming for, but these categories then came in as ways of limiting the amount and type of support that people could get. And psychosocial disability is, even within the disability categories within the NDIS, it's a bit of an exceptional one because it's an entire diagnostic category that just is the same as this disability category. So it doesn't actually fit the pattern of other disability categories within the policy for which it was created, which is just fantastically convoluted, I know.
All right, well, thank you very much, Terri. We'll have to.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.